What is a Sega game? Back in Sega's console maker heyday, that was quite an easy question to answer. Anything produced by or under license by Sega Enterprises, as deigned by those iconic BIOS startups on every console, was a Sega game. But post Dreamcast, what a Sega game is tends to have gotten a little bit strange. We have Sega IPs in games that Sega had literally nothing to do with, and we see Sega's name brandished on series and consoles which have literally nothing to do with Sega. Again, strange, I think you'll agree. This is Dan the Mega Driver of the Sega Guys, and if you don't believe me, let's take a look at 8 games and see just how Sega they really are. Let's start with Streets of Rage 4, the much awaited sequel to the trilogy of iconic Mega Drive and Genesis classic brawlers. And by God, did it deliver. A fantastic belt scroller with a gorgeous art style, incredible gameplay that channeled the feel of the original game and updated it with additions and features that intelligently complemented the classic mechanics. And of course, it has an incredible soundtrack that features music by series composer Yuzo Koshiro. But Streets of Rage 4's development history is almost completely detached from Sega. Lizard Cube cut their teeth with a remake of Wonder Boy The Dragon's Trap and wanted to remake Streets of Rage, an idea that eventually morphed into a full sequel. Developed by Lizard Cube and published by Dotemu, initially it was a digitally only title that did get a physical release by Limited Run Games, which they took so long to fulfill for me that the official retail release came out before it was delivered. Thanks, you useless twats. Sega had literally nothing to do with this release in any way, aside from licensing Lizard Cube and Dotemu the IP. So a Sega game? It's under license from Sega, so it counts in the most minimal sense, but yeah, Sega had nothing to do with this. So what the hell does Crash Bandicoot have to do with Sega? This is the former PlayStation mascot who was owned by Activision, which is now owned by Xbox, and thank you Game Pass for giving me a platform to record this footage. Crash would normally have nothing to do with Sega. And that would be even less the case in this Beanox remake of Naughty Dog's Sony published kart racer. And yet, Crash Bandicoot Racing Batobi Nitro, Crash Team Racing Nitro Kart in the West, sports Sega's title on the spine and the back of the box. Yes, in Japan, CTR Nitro Kart was published by Sega for the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4. I couldn't find out exactly how much Sega contributed to the localization of this game in Japan. The Japanese trailer makes absolutely no mention of Sega, so it's possible that they just picked up the publishing rights to the game at a later date. However, since they published both the physical and digital versions, Sega at least expended some effort to bring Crash Bandicoot's Racer to Japan. So yes, this Crash Bandicoot outing, in Japan at least, is a Sega game. ToeJam and Earl are characters that feel intrinsically linked to Sega's 1990s image, with the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis games being some of the most iconic, almost as iconic as games featuring Echo the Dolphin, the Streets of Rage crew, and even Sonic the Hedgehog. A third game would arrive in 2003 on the original Xbox, also developed and published by Sega. But then it all went a little bit quiet. That is, until Back in the Groove, headed by series creator Greg Johnson, smashed past its Kickstarter goal and was released on pretty much every platform in 2019. Johnson's Human Nature Studios developed and published the game, and it's a fantastic adventure that calls back to the original game in all of the right ways. It's available on a variety of platforms and is so frequently on sale that it's criminal if you haven't picked it up yet. Since Johnson owns the rights, he didn't even need Sega's licensing, meaning Sega can't even claim to have licensed this one. So, a Sega game then? Despite featuring iconic characters tied to Sega's history, it has as much to do with Sega as modern day Crash Bandicoot has with Sony. And that means to say, nothing. Worms is another iconic franchise with its roots in the 1990s. Created, developed and published by Team 17, the first Worms turn-based strategy game was a hit that produced numerous sequels published by a number of suitors. Which is kind of ironic to think that now, in the modern day, Team 17 is primarily a publisher rather than a developer. As the early 2000s rolled around, the series decided to transition to 3D and Worms 3D was born. Activision were initially attached as the publishers, but later they dropped out. So Sega, being no stranger to questionable transitions into 3D at the time, became the publisher of the game in Europe for all platforms and worldwide for Xbox. The game itself is alright, quite fun in multiplayer with the series' traditional trademark humour present, but no one would really pick this 3D entry over the classic 2D games. A Sega game then? Perhaps more than any other game on this list? Yes it is! Alex Kidd was Sega's early answer to Super Mario, and Miracle World specifically is synonymous with the Sega Master System. While the original Alex Kidd in Miracle World has had releases on Xbox Live Arcade and Switch Online, that release was just an emulated SMS version. However, in 2021, Janken Team released Alex Kidd in Miracle World DX, a full-on remake of the Master System classic that allowed you to flick between the original and remake graphics on the fly. And it's DX that all the footage that you see here comes from. So, with the original game visuals included, it has to be a Sega game, right? Well, once again, Sega have absolutely nothing to do with this one. They didn't publish it, they didn't develop it, once again, they just licensed the IP. So like Streets of Rage 4, if it wasn't for the franchise, it wouldn't be attached to Sega at all. But it is licensed by them, so it counts. Just. Ah, Mr. Potter, what a surprise to see you here. Hogwarts Legacy is an RPG set in the school famous for housing the world's most popular bespectacled wizard, albeit in the 19th century, around 100 years before Harry would attend. This role-playing game was one of Warner Bros' biggest successes in recent years, selling over 30 million copies at the time of recording. So what has this got to do with Sega? Well, in Japan, once again, you'll find Sega's name slapped all over the box, as it was they who published the physical versions for all platforms in the region. This makes it a little bit of a harder one to quantify. Sega seemingly didn't do any of the localization work, given that Warner Bros. Themselves published the digital versions in Japan. So this isn't the same case as Crash Bandicoot Racing. However, Sega seemingly shelled out for the production of the physical versions. So, produced by Sega? At least partly. Yes. In 2020, long-time Sega fans could finally rejoice at a version of Panzer Dragoon updated with modern visuals for contemporary systems. But there was a catch. Sega once again had nothing to do with the resurrection and making of one of their legendary games. Megapixel Studio handled development duties as Forever Entertainment published this ambitious remake. This initially digital-only Switch exclusive had several problems on release. It was another where I also went to limited run games, only to be disappointed with the service. Anyway, several patches and releases to other platforms later, it is now an enjoyable, albeit an alternative interpretation of Sega's Saturn classic, though the art style remains divisive. And what did Sega have to do with this? As I said before, absolutely nothing. Neither publishing or developing, selling the rights to Forever Entertainment like Bart's Soul, the game counts once again solely under the license buy criteria. I'm saving the best for last now. Killzone was supposedly the Sony PlayStation's Halo killer. In truth, Guerrilla Games' first exclusive title for their would-be owners is decidedly average, and one that I find a little bit of a chore to play today. For some reason, Sony didn't see fit to publish this title in the PlayStation's home in Japan, and that's where Sega stepped in. As you can see from the box art, it's Sega's name brandished on every single side of the box, and it is conceivably they who did all of the localization work, though it must be said that the dialogue is still entirely in English, though obviously I'm playing the PAL version here in this footage, which is the same for Hogwarts and Crash Racing, because that's the version I have access to. But Really, this is absolutely as surreal as they come. Sega publishing a Sony game for the PlayStation 2 in its native Japan? It's absolutely bizarre. So once again, in the madcap realm of Japanese video games, Killzone is a Sega game. All in all, this has been an interesting list, I hope you'll agree. Killzone definitely was the most surprising one for me. That Sony didn't want to publish this Western developed FPS in Japan, but somehow Sega did, is really bizarre. You couple this with other games like Hogwarts, Worms and Crash Team Racing, and the fact they wouldn't publish or produce Panzer Dragoon, Streets of Rage or Alex Kidd themselves is even more confusing. It's a crying shame too that games like ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove, Shenmue 3 being another, have been backed by Kickstarters and picked up by other publishers, when Sega really could have swept in and picked these up to make them proper Sega games too. Thankfully, with Sega's reboots of Streets of Rage and more incoming, this fragmenting of Sega franchises not published by Sega, along with the reliance of publishing non-Sega games, will become a thing of the past. Or maybe it won't, and Sega will end up doing something like publishing the next Halo game on their Japanese PlayStation 5 or something. But what do you think? And what other non-Sega Sega games can you think of? I hope that you found this topic interesting and entertaining, because after all, I think this is just a little bit of fun. If so, give us a like and a subscribe, as that really helps the channel, and if you want to be extra mega, think about becoming a member with a bunch of awesome perks from as little as 99p. Regardless of any of that, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you on the Sega side.